Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this video lesson on First Civilizations of Humanity. This is part 3 of 3 video lessons. I am Miss Jennifer Blank, and I will be your guide on this journey. All right, so key questions, right? So we talked about in the first video lesson, first of 3, we talked about what are the historical thinking skills and what are pegs and Persia and how do we use them, right? So if you forgot those, you should go back and rewatch that video lesson. And then in video lesson number 2, we started talking about this last focus question. What characteristics distinguish the ancient civilizations of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria? Now, in video number 2, we talked about Sumer and Akkad, and today we're going to talk about Babylon and Assyria, in addition to a couple of other civilizations like the Phoenicians and the Hittites that were also important. So, Babylon, big deal. Babylon was a big deal. So it was ruled by Hammurabi, and what distinguished him from other rulers, not only of Babylon, but also of other civilizations, was the strict code of laws that he created and enforced throughout his entire empire, okay? This was his greatest achievement. So in your head, Hammurabi, law code, Hammurabi. Like this is, you need to associate these things. All right, there were rules and consequences that addressed daily life. It governed the entire region of Mesopotamia, the whole thing, okay? And they were eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth type of laws. Now, one thing that I find fascinating is that a lot of people think that the eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth comes from the Bible. Don't really know why they think that, because the Bible says the exact opposite. The eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth comes from this guy right here, good old Hammurabi. Now, government assumed the responsibility of protecting its citizens, but people also had laws that they had to follow. So in order to be protected by their government, they had laws that protected them, but also kind of stopped them a little bit. There were certain things they couldn't necessarily get away with. But it was nice because they no longer needed to resort to violence to solve their problems, because the government created a built-in system to help with that. Okay, so now Babylon. So the social classes were vastly similar to the Egyptians, and when we get to ancient Egypt, you're going to see these similarities. And many people are already familiar with ancient Egypt, so if you do know a little bit about it, this might help you kind of absorb information about Babylon. But if you don't, absorbing information about Egypt is going to be easier because we've talked about Babylon. So I kind of like to make that comparison early on. Now, the social classes were very similar, but Babylon had a lot more slaves. They were really into slavery. Hammurabi's empire, unfortunately, did fall apart after his death. It wasn't able to be maintained by subsequent rulers. All right, so his law code. It was significant because it organized many existing laws into one like uniform code that people could see and that people could understand. So in examples, we talked about the first one already, but if you steal, your hand gets cut off. Sounds fun, right? But, you know, people didn't steal as much because, you know, that's a big opportunity cost for that. You know, you steal, I mean, even just a little loaf of bread and, you know, off with your hand, like that's it. That's pretty hardcore. It's kind of harsh, especially by our modern standards. So during the era of Mesopotamia's rule, there were a lot of changes in the region's culture. So armies were constantly battling for control of really fertile land. Whoops, I don't know why that keeps doing that. Different peoples ruled Mesopotamia. The Hittites, as I mentioned earlier, were the first group that took over after Hammurabi's death. Then you have the Kassites, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about those guys. But the big 4 that I gave you at the beginning with the focus question, those are the ones you really want to focus on. And each group, during the time of its rule, affected the culture of the region. All right, so here's a map for you. So I just wanted to include this. There's no focus question associated with it. I just want you to kind of take a look, get used to examining maps and understanding like the key right here. The key right over here, Babylon Empire, that's the yellow, right? The Assyrian Empire is in pink. So that's going to help you understand like when the empires were happening and how much territory they actually controlled. Now here we have a secondary source which I want you to read. So secondary sources are very important. We get a lot of our historical information from primary sources as historians, but secondary sources are also key because they help us develop interpretations and evaluate arguments about primary sources and the things that happened in history. So this is a secondary source. I can provide you the link in class from where this comes from. The ancient city of Babylon, under King Nebuchadnezzar II, must have been a wonder to the traveler's eye. In addition to its size, wrote Herodotus, a historian in 450 BC, Babylon surpasses in splendor any city in the known world. Herodotus claimed the outer walls were 56 miles in length, 80 feet thick, and 320 feet high. Wide enough, he said, to allow a 4-horse chariot to turn. The inner walls were not so thick as the first, but hardly less strong. Inside the walls were fortresses and temples containing immense statues of solid gold. Rising above the city was the famous Tower of Babel, a temple to the god Marduk that seemed to reach to the heavens. So this gives you a sense of what life might have been like in ancient Babylon and how visitors to the city, to the central city, viewed it. Its magnificence, its splendor, its sheer size. It just conveyed power and authority, which is one of the reasons why Babylon was so powerful. All right, so the Hittites and the Kassites. Let's look at that. The Hittites were the first to master ironworking, so that sets them apart, and that's very important. And it made the strongest weapons of the time, one of the reasons why they were able to conquer Babylon in the first place. They used the chariot, which was a wheeled, horse-drawn cart, but it was mostly used for fighting. So the way that it was constructed allowed fighters to be nimble and mobile and just basically kill more effectively. The Hittites were taken over by the Kassites after their king was assassinated, and the Kassites ruled for just about 400 years after that point. All right, the Assyrians, these guys are big. Now, when you think Assyrians, you think army, think military, think like go get them, big, strong, killing lots of people. Like that's the Assyrians. Now, the Hittites and the Assyrians both had strong armies, but the Assyrians were even stronger. They both used chariots and iron weapons, which at the time was a very new technology. They did spread terror before battles. They really wanted people to fear them so that they wouldn't challenge them. They did this by looting villages and burning crops prior to actually engaging in military battle. They wanted to spread fear throughout the society they were trying to conquer. The Assyrian kings ruled their empires through local leaders, all right, so that you still have a centralized authority, but each governor or local leader had control over a small territory, and they reported directly to the Assyrian king. Local leaders also demanded heavy taxes from their charges, and that's part of how they were able to afford to stay in power and pay for their armies. Now, the Chaldeans were interesting. They attacked the Assyrians when, after the Assyrians weakened, and then they destroyed their empire. So Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt Babylon into this beautiful city that had, I don't know how that keeps happening, that had these famous hanging gardens, okay? They were beautiful hanging gardens. I've got pictures coming. They admired the Sumerian culture. They studied their language, and they actually built temples to the Sumerian gods, which, of course, by this point are long gone. But Sumerian culture was so incredible and so amazing that the Chaldeans brought it back, okay? And Babylon at this point becomes a center for astronomy, which is very, very important. All right, so the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians built probably the most extensive trading society at this time. It was huge, like massively important. So their resources, they love cedar. They love cedar because they can use it for timber to build stuff, not just like houses, but more ships. Because shipbuilding was very important because you can't trade without the ships, right? So you got to have things to trade. They accessed the sea for trade, and they built fantastic, amazing harbors that really facilitated trade and made it much more profitable. They expanded trade by sailing ships around the Mediterranean Sea. They also founded several new colonies along the trade route. So this is the first effort at colonization, right? They also became very wealthy through trade, like massively wealthy. They used their alphabet and a form of written language to record their economic activities. They did make writing much easier for everyone. They made it a lot more efficient. And the Phoenician alphabet is actually the basis for the English language. Good times, right? Hey. All right, so here's another map. So this is Phoenicia around 800 BC. So you see, look at whenever you're looking at a map, you always want to look at the key. That's going to tell you how to read it and let you know what you should be paying attention to. Okay, so Phoenicia is in pink, and then the area of Phoenician settlement is in this orangish color here. So you can kind of take a look at the map and see just how big and powerful and impressive Phoenicia was at the time. All right, so now you can pause the video, right? And here's a nice, lovely chart breaking down all of these key civilizations that we talked about in this lesson, right? The Hittites, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, and the Phoenicians. Okay, so I'm not going to go through each of this point by point. you can read. So you're going to pause the video and you're going to write all this down. Now, if you have any questions about any of this material, write it down and then ask me about it in class. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the official end of part 3. I hope you learned what you needed to, and I will see you in our next series of video lessons.